Let me just start. Hello, everyone. It's great to see all of you back. Today we have Clément, who's going to tell us about migration with and without families. Yanos and Marlon also are on the Q&A today, so we have extra attendance. As you all know, this is a very, usual platform. Most of you have been here before, so I guess there's no reason to make all the disclaimers and announcements. Maybe the only important one is that if you have any questions, just write them down in the Q&A. Marlon and Yanos will try to answer them. If some of these questions we feel like are going to be important for the prosecution of the talk, then we'll directly address them to Clément. And please bear in mind that in the last 15 minutes, we'll open up the mic. You just raise your hand in the end, and then you can ask your question directly. I guess there's nothing more to be saying, but leaving the floor to Clément. And Clément, the floor is yours. Take it away.
Thank you so much for having me, and thank you all for attending. So today I'll be telling you about a paper that we recently finished with Yanos Zylberberg, who's here, Marlon Seror was also here, and Joan Monras, who's not online, but not far. So this paper tries and think about migration with and without family in the context of China. And in China, migrants are often described as a floating population. So you can think of our paper as trying to making sense of this description. So leaving children behind is a dominant feature of migration worldwide. So it's true of international migrants. So if you think of, Filipino immigrants, you find that 55% of them in 2007 had left at least one child behind. If you now move from international migration to internal migration, I guess the greatest event in terms of internal migration has been China, with more than 200 million people moving by 2010. You see that and that's a UNICEF number, about 59 million rural children do not live with their parents, with the idea that their parents would have moved often to urban areas, leaving them behind, not on their own necessarily, often with grandparents or other members of the family. So in both contexts, the parents who migrate, they do leave their children behind, but they remit a large share of their income to the family. And there's a literature which, especially in the context of international migrants, really emphasizes this remittance motive of migration. What we'll be bringing is to put those pieces together, as well as a new fact that has been highlighted in Joan Monras' previous work, which is that migrants tend to concentrate in big cities. And here they had highlighted it for Mexican migrants in the US. We're going to look at Chinese migrants in China, but we also have stylized facts, and using icons, we can show that this is true around the world, both of internal migrants and international migrants around the world. So the main idea of our paper is that the migrants who go without their family are attracted, or their objective function is to earn high wages, high nominal wages, and consume as little as possible where they earn those high wages in this very expensive destination by consuming at origin, that is, remitting money to their family that will be consumed at the origin. And of course, this will affect the spatial distribution of economic activity by delinking, if you want, where work is happening and where consumption decisions or consumption is happening. So the key determinant of this will be for us in our mind to costs of migration, and the cost of migrating with the family, some of which will be monetary, some of them might be non-monetary. We'll come back to this, that encourage them or give them an incentive to leave their family dependents behind and remit a big share of their income, and to chase these high nominal wage cities and live with low quality housing and generally consume less at destination. And we're thinking of China as being really an interesting setting where we see by between 2000 and 2005, 30 million people moving from rural to urban areas. And we'll see that they really seem to locate in the cities with high housing costs. And that's where the non-monetary component comes in, which is that they will, at destination, face restrictions in their access, for example, to public services, because of restrictions imposed by policymakers on internal migrants, especially if they're moving with a family. So now that's the general pitch. Now, it's not an easy thing to look at because, of course, both migration decisions and those policies I talked about are endogenous, and policymakers react to how much migration there is and how good the economy is doing locally. And you really need to think about it in equilibrium because, of course, having more migrants in a place will affect outcomes for labor, for example, labor markets or housing markets at destination, which itself will change migration decisions in the choice of destinations. So what do we do in this paper? So we'll be first showing some empirical facts, which I've already alluded to, the fact that rural migrants concentrate in expensive cities, the fact that disproportionately in those expensive cities, they'll be living without family and in very poor housing conditions, and the fact that they will remit disproportionately and consume at origin, especially when they are living without family and in expensive locations. Then we'll develop a quantitative model of location choice, which will, be basically add one more element, one more stage, if you want, in the modeling of migration choices, because migrants will decide first whether to migrate or to stay, but also whether to bring their family with them or not, and then which destinations they'll be going to. I'm describing it as a sequential process, but we're not thinking of them as being sequential decisions. It's just that the model will have those three nests. And the idea is that we'll allow migrants to consume at destination and at origin. So we'll make explicit the link of that these migrants who migrate without family, but also potentially migrants who migrate with family, but have some family members still left behind, people, and that they remit income to, okay? And that will be what we'll call consumption at origin via remittances. We'll then estimate this model, and we'll be we'll try to be quite tight on identification of the key parameters of that model. And what this estimation of the model will allow us to provide is to recover migration costs. So that is in order to rationalize the migration decisions we see, given prices, wages, and the parameters of the model, what will be left to explain migration decisions, and this will be especially interested in the relative migration decisions of family migrants with family and without. We'll be able to recover migration costs that rationalize it for every rural origin, every mode with and without family, and every destination. And then this will allow us then to do counterfactuals and to think about what are the main drivers of the migration patterns that we see in terms of overall migration levels, but also in terms of choice of destination and in terms of choice of living, of migrating with and without their family. And we'll be looking at things that the literature has thought of before, for example, this famous migration policy and relaxing policy-driven migration restrictions. But we'll bring in new ingredients, such as thinking about differences in living costs or remittance motives and how important those are in shaping migration decisions. In terms of contribution, we're thinking of our paper as being, if you want, contributing to this big literature on structural models of location choice, especially in the context of internal migration of developing countries. And what we'll be doing is to propose the first spatial model, spatial equilibrium model, where we allow a bit like in the Laga, which doesn't have a spatial component, but where there'll be two migration modes, where people might be able to choose between migrating with their family and without. Then we'll, of course, we are really on shoulders of giants in terms of thinking about the role of the fact that migrants keep ties with their origin, that part of the migration might be origin from an objective, which is to remit more income. What we'll be doing is that we'll be thinking about those motives, those remittance motives, those linked with the migration in the choice, while modeling the choice of migrating and where to go. Okay, which is quite hard to do if you're thinking of, for example, international migrants. Okay, this choice of destination and this choice of leaving family behind or not has not been modeled as such. And then finally, because we'll be interested in this location, in this concentration of migrants in those big cities, we'll be thinking about also, we'll be contributing to the literature about big cities and whether big cities are big enough or they should be larger, congestion forces, etc. And there's a literature on that. We're thinking of our paper as putting in another element, new element to it, which is to say that even if cities are very might be congested, the migrants might be able to go there, leave their family behind, earn money there, and remit back. So the idea that they might be gains, they might reap the gains from agglomeration while escaping congestion costs. So that was perhaps too long an introduction for the time I have. So I'll jump right in unless there's any question.
Yeah, I think you can go ahead.
Okay. So let me go through a few status facts. So first status facts, there's lots of migration in China between 2000 and 2005. That will be the period we're looking at. We think of the previous period as being the beginning of rural-urban migration, which was basically banned before the reform era. And 2000, 2005 is really the moment where it kicks in. And it's, as I said, most of the migration that's happening is rural to urban. Of course, the story is different in the 2010s and 2020s. So we'll be looking at this specific period of the history of China. And we'll be using extensively population censuses and one that's called 1% population survey. That's still a lot of people, but basically a representative 1% of the population to both measure migration flows, rents, and housing. So the basic idea is that we'll identify rural migrants living in urban areas thanks to their household registration, thanks to the fact that they have an agricultural hukou. And this registration is part of this policy to control the flows. It was part of the policy that was banning basically migration or heavily restricting migration pre-reform. And now it's one part of the basis for restricting access. So allowing migrants to move and work at destination, but for example, restricting access to public services such as education or healthcare. So now let's, the first last fact that we document is the fact that migrants concentrate in high wage, high rent cities. So how do we look at concentration? The way we can look at it is we look at how many migrants are there in each city. So what's the share of migrants in each city as compared to what's the share of each resident in each city. So implicitly, we are using as a counterfactual people who are not migrants, who are residents. We can perform the same exercise while looking at urban to urban migrants as a counterfactual. The results are really look very similar. The basic idea is is to check whether migrants allocate themselves proportional to population, resident population, or not. As we see, it's really not the case. What's happening is that there's many more rural migrants in these very high nominal wage cities, which happen to be also, of course, the high rent cities, so the most costly cities to live in. How do they manage to, being being poor rural migrants? How do they manage to live in these expensive cities? What they do, and that's what we argue, is that they tend to live without family. So if you look at the least expensive cities, the probability relative to residents that migrants live without their family is the same. Okay? I should probably be clear about what we mean when we say living without the family. So what we'll be looking at is whether people are in their households that we see in the census, whether they live either with children or with their parents. Now, of course, one might doubt that, not every migrant has children, or indeed we'll assume that most of them will have parents. But in terms of children, some of them might be too young to have children, so we might incorrectly infer that they're living without their family because they don't actually have children yet. So what we can do is we can do the same exercise by looking only at mothers, because the census does ask women their complete fertility history, whether they have children, whether they're alive, and whether they live with them. Okay, so we can do the same exercise with mothers, and we find similar patterns, which is you find extremely high rates of migrants that are living without their family in these very expensive destinations. So we're talking 40%. And for mothers, the level is, I think, 44% in the most expensive destinations. Okay. Now, living without their family has, of course, it's probably a hard thing to do, but it also allows you to save on many costs. One of them is housing. And we see those migrants in these most expensive cities living with poor housing conditions. So some of them might be in dorms, they might not have, a bathroom, etc., and they might share a room with many others, etc. So we're thinking of this as reflecting basically a migration behavior, which is, let's maximize nominal income, reduce my expenditures at destination, and remit part of my income at origin. So how can we look at this? We can look directly beyond housing at the consumption shares of non-tradable for migrants who are coming with their family and without their family. So how much of this consumption is done locally? And we see that migrants with their family consume a lot more non-tradable. So housing is one of them, but you can think of education, of etc. Okay, so there are many other aspects of this local services consumption. And then we can directly look, and that's now not using the census, but using representative migration surveys. We can look at what fraction of their income they remit, what fraction of their income do they send back to consume at origin. And what we see is that on average, migrants without their family remit about 28% of their income, as compared to 11% for the migrants living with their family. So again, that's going back to the idea that they are living with some dependent family members, but some of them might still be at home, so there might be some family members at home. As you see, there's this considerable variation with a heavy tail of people remitting up to 50, 60% of their income. Okay, so those are the main stylus facts, and those are what serve as motivation for a model. Any question that I should address?
No, there are no questions. I have just a clarifying question. So,
Yeah.
come on, what does it mean poor housing conditions? So, is there a formal definition of that? Just
no. So we have information on how big their housing is, whether there's a bathroom, whether they share it with whether it's a dorm, etc. And we make a standardized index of that, and we call it poor housing conditions. We can look at different dimensions of it. They all do go in the same direction. Yeah. The idea is, so you could look at rents, etc., but they don't always pay rent. So, looking at prices, not always easy. So, there's a good, good measurement of what their housing looks like in the census. Okay. Right. So, I'll first introduce a sort of very general modeling of this migration choice, and then I'll go into a more restrictive or more, I'll go to the version of the model we take to the data. So the main feature of the model is to have different locations that are either rural or urban, and each of those locations will have wages, amenities, and a price of non-tradables. And they will have an initial distribution of population. So we're thinking of our period as, at 2000, if you want, as the beginning of time, when suddenly migration is allowed. And we think of people starting to make the migration decisions at that point. we will, so for this version of the model, we do have an extension that allows for it, but we will disregard urban to urban migration, okay, which as I described is not very important in the period quantitatively very important in the period we look at. So we'll be mostly considering rural residents who are considering or are thinking of moving to urban areas. So moving means migration. So that's the M here. Then if you decide to migrate, you might migrate with or without your children. So we'll use the J index to index if it's 1, you're migrating on your own. And if it's 2, you're migrating with family. And then you choose your destination. Okay, and we'll have so the one novel feature is this 3 nests, so there's 3 aspects of the migration decision. The other novel feature is to have consumption, to have more complicated consumption patterns for migrants than what's usually found in the literature by allowing for this consumption at origin. We'll disregard also heterogeneity in labor. There's a lot, it's mostly unskilled migration. So here's the utility function. So you can think of a household as giving utility to an older generation and a younger generation. If they migrate, they will suffer a utility cost of migrating. And they have an idiosyncratic taste shock, which like in most of the structural spatial equilibrium model of migration, will give idiosyncratic choice, preferences for staying or going to different destinations. And for simplicity, that's where the simplifications come in. We'll just assume that we can represent linearly the utility of the household in terms of the utility of the old generation and the utility of the young generation. And we can even simplify things further by just having log utilities. So what's the budget constraint of the households? And that's one innovation, depends on their migration decision. Because depending on what we call the living arrangements, depending on which members of the households are living, the consumption of the different generations will happen in different places. And hence, the prices that are relevant for those different choices for these consumption choices will differ, as well as where they draw their income from, of course. Okay, so I will consider 3 living arrangements, one where the old and young are still at origin, one where the old go to their destination, but the young stay back, and one where both the young and the old are going. Will be pretty standard on the consumption side, but we actually have we can actually test that the Cobb-Douglas assumption seems to be verified in our case by estimating a CES, ensuring that that the Cobb-Douglas assumption seems to be okay given our setting. So we have a Cobb-Douglas function that for the old generation is combination of tradable, so tradables can happen in any place, and non-tradables. And the key innovation is that some of these non-tradables might be consumed at origin. Okay, so you might send back money for a house. For the young, the tradable again, the tradable consumption can happen anywhere, but the non-tradable consumption will happen in one place. Okay, so now in terms of the stream of wages, we'll be thinking that if the old generation is in rural areas, it will be WR, so just the wage in rural areas. If the old generation is in urban areas, it will be WU, and will allow at first a different share of your income to be available if you are living with your family or if you're living without. So that, for example, could accommodate situations where people are working a lot more when they're without their family. Okay, or vice versa, that when they're remitting some part of their income, some part of it might be lost due to remitted costs. Now, with log utility, we can write expressions for the indirect utility of the household under the three different options. The first one is pretty straightforward. It's the utility, indirect utility of staying in rural areas. You draw a wage, that's WR, and you're paying the price on your consumptions, that's PR, the price at origin. The indirect utility from migrating but leaving your children behind is, you're drawing your wage at destination, but you are paying a composite index. So the prices, it's not just one price, it's a composite of the prices at destination for the share that you're consuming at destination. So it's going to be the non-tradables and the share of those non-tradables you're consuming at destination. And then you'll be thinking about the origin prices for the two parts, for the parts of your income that you're remitting to your children, and the part that you're consuming at origin for use. And then there are those two costs. One is the cost that comes from remitting part of your income, and this is the cost, the utility cost for migrating. And of course, we're allowing this utility for migrating to be different if you're migrating on your own. Now, if households migrate with their family dependents, they'll be earning the same wage as with their leave their children behind, but they'll be facing a different set of prices and costs. Why? Because they will now be consuming much more of their income at destination, right? Because they have their children with them, and so they will spend a higher share of those non-tradables at destinations, and we're still allowing them to remit some money back. Okay, and then there's like a different set of costs associated with this. So if you're just thinking about the choice between migrating and leaving your children behind, or migrating and taking your children with you, you will see that this will depend in a big part on the relative prices of consumption at destination and origin. Okay? With this idea that, if the destination is very expensive, you might consider leaving your children behind. Now, of course, you're also considering these different aspects of migration costs, which come, I've introduced which come in a different part, directly into the utility, or as reducing how much income you have. Now, from now on, I'll just be summarizing those two aspects into a tau, which will work as a migration cost or migration frictions for those two options. And the central part of the model is how people make those decisions across, make three types of decisions. One is whether to stay or to migrate with or without, so M1 is without or with their family, and where to go. So we'll be thinking of the epsilon as drawn from a general extreme value distribution, and we'll be imposing a three-nested structure. Okay, so what you might have seen in the past might have been just two nests, whether to stay or go, and if you go, which destination to go to. So we're adding one level, if you so this aspect of choosing whether to go with or without your family. So given these functional assumptions, we can simply look at or summarize the probability to J migrate, so migrate with or without your family, from R to U, and that will depend on these different components. One is, thinking about the value of migrating as compared to staying at home. The second is the value of J migrating as compared to the overall value so VRM is the value of migrating, and you're comparing this to the inclusive value of being bored in rural origin R. That includes staying and migrating. In the second term, you have the value of J migrating from R, and this is the inclusive value of migrating at all from R, with or without your family. And the last term is about J migrating from R to a specific destination U, and in the denominator, the inclusive value of J migrating from that origin, whatever the destination. What will be very important are those elasticities, gammas, mu's, and lambda j, that, as I could have shown you in that graph as well, that intervene as a substitution between the different alternatives for this differentness. So gamma is for the decision to stay or go. The mu is about the decision to take your family or leave it behind. The lambda 1 is about choice of destination for people who go on their own. Lambda 2 is choice of destination, substitution between destination for migrants who go with their family. So with this model, we can rationalize and we can have predictions that line up with our style as fact, that migrants will sort into expensive destination because they have this possibility to migrate, to remit and consume at origin, especially if they're migrating without their family, that they will remit a high share of their income when they're leaving dependent behind, and that if you have the cost of migrating with family will increase the share of income remitted and magnify sorting into expensive locations. So, of course, making migration more expensive reduces more migration altogether. But if you're increasing the relative cost of bringing family with you, then you expect more migrants to substitute towards migration without family, remit a higher share of the income, and choose more expensive destinations. Are there any questions here before I move to estimation?
There were a number of questions in the Q&A, which Marlon and Yanos answered very efficiently.
Okay.
Maybe there's a question that I think I had and also Laszlo had, is about distinction between temporary migration and permanent migration. Presumably, you do one thing or the other depending on then whether you leave family behind or not. Have you given a thought of that, or maybe you want to defer this to later stage?
Yes. So we're not thinking of migration without family as necessarily temporary migration, and migration with family as necessarily permanent. So we do have information on migrants' expectations, how long they intend to stay, and they don't seem to differ dramatically between the two different modes. Now, it's a very special context where migration has just been allowed, and I don't know, in the sense that the long-term expectations of migrants might also be completely off, given what the realization of and the booming economy has been after that. I think it's a relevant margin in many different contexts. Perhaps in others, we're thinking that we thought that the first order might have been this decision to migrate with or without your family. But the two might be important and intersect in some ways. Okay, so so there's many parameters in that model. Some of them are basically descriptive statistics. So under the assumptions that we have on the Cobb-Douglas preferences, we can identify those preference parameters, alpha, beta, and is it Xi? I think it's Xi, or Chi perhaps, based on just consumption shares. What's more interesting for us and important and crucial for our paper is to estimate those migration elasticities well. So I'll be going through estimation of the lambdas, the mu's, and the gammas, and how we recover the taus, the bilateral migration costs. I won't say too much about how we estimate the effects of basically how we estimate the labor demand elasticity and the housing supply elasticity. So those parameters will be important to predict how wages react or rents react to an inflow of migrants. And since we have an equilibrium model, these reactions will themselves affect migration decisions. So we are estimating those elasticities by looking at exogenous migration shocks, building on previous work we have, and looking at the effects on wages and rents. So basically a shift share instruments for the inflow of migrants in different destinations and the resulting effects on wages and rents. So the way we'll estimate the model is basically going backwards, or so starting with the lower nets. So we'll first consider the decision to migrate to a given destination, conditional on migrating, and conditional on a type of migration. So we'll be doing a separate estimation for migrants without family, NF, and migration with family, WF. We will have rural origin and origin fixed effects that will capture, everything that's fixed at the level of the origin. And of course, what's key in our setting is to think about the value of migrating in a given destination U. And that depends on the wage, but it also depends on the price of the cost of living at destination. What's key in our setting is that we'll be building that costs, the price index that's relevant for that type of migration, and will include aspects that will have to do with indeed the cost of living at destination, but also the cost of living at origin, depending on these parameters that I showed. So we'll try and construct the actual the price index that corresponds to the actual consumption basket. Importantly, wages and also prices at destination are endogenous to how many migrants come in. So we do need instruments for that. Okay, so we will be we'll be using something that has been already done in the literature. Depending on the sectoral specialization of this destination, we can think about the trade shock, which was the inclusion of China, accession of China to WTO, as moving labor demand differently across different destinations in China. As you see, this is a strong instrument, and importantly, we recover very high elasticities of migration with respect to real wage at destination, and especially high, basically double, for those migrants who go without family, okay, which is what you expect. So they're more they're reacting more to relative opportunities. They're more flexible in terms of the destination choice. Now, once we have this elasticity of substitution between destinations, conditional on the mode of migration and conditional on migrating, we can go back one and look at the choice of conditional on migrating, the choice of migrating with or without your family. And we'll be looking, based on our model, we have this choice depends on the relative value of migrating, or the value of migrating with or without your family. So what we can do is to have an estimation that depends on, so we'll be looking at the fraction of people from a given origin who migrate with their family or versus without their family, and we'll regress this on the relative value of migrating with or without their family. Now, what we can do, sorry, this explanation was a bit off. So that's one version of our specification. What we're actually doing and what I'm showing you here is the probability of conditional migrating, J migrating, so it could be either migrating with or without your family, regress on the value of migrating, J migrating from R, and with an origin fixed effect. So holding fixed everything that's at the level of the origin. And we'll be instrumenting the value of migrating by predicted rents based on land supply constraints at destination. So here we'll adapt something that, for example, Nina Hari had in her AR paper, where we'll be thinking about the constraints to city growth by looking at natural obstacles to the boundaries at the boundaries of the city as instruments for rents at destination. And we're thinking of rents at destination as differentially imposing a cost on migration family. So we'll be interacting those rents with a dummy for migrating with your family. And that's a very strong instrument. And we're finding that the the probability of choosing a migration mode does respond strongly to the value of migrating with that migration mode, instrumented by living costs at destination. Once we have, and sorry for being a bit both slow and confusing, once we have this elasticity of between migration modes, we can go back once and reach the upper nest of the migration decision, which is to choose whether to migrate or not migrate. And here we'll be doing the classic estimation, where we'll be looking at the relative shares of people staying at origin or migrating. So staying at origin would be pi r, migrating would be 1 minus pi r, and we will regress this on the relative values, the relative utilities values from either staying or migrating. And we'll be instrumenting these relative values of migrating versus staying by instruments that we've used before, which are agricultural price shocks that change the value of the agricultural output, that is, change also the value of staying at home. And we're finding an elasticity of 1.3 with a strong F-star. Once we have all these different elasticity, these different elements, the gammas, the mu's, and the lambda j, we can recover the non-monetary costs that rationalize observed migration probabilities. Basically, we know how people make their choices. We observe the monetary elements of those decisions, the wages and the prices. What we need is to get at the non-monetary components, is to back out, the migration costs that explain why people might not want to go to a place despite these high wages or despite this low living cost. And we can compare the migration costs we recover from our model with what you'd get through other models, and we believe that they have a value added in terms of rationalizing the decisions of migrants across the different modes and within those different modes in terms of choice of destination. So, okay, I know I'm 2 minutes from the time, so I'll try and be quick on this, but what we'll be interested in doing now that we've estimated our model is to highlight the different determinants, the important factors for the migration patterns that we observe. The first one will be pretty simple. It will be just shutting down remittances. So if you don't allow migrants to remit, what will happen? The second one will be to look at something that basically so far only our model can really do, which is to look in equilibrium at the effect of changing the costs of specific expenditures, non-tradable expenditures, such as the cost of education across destination and how it changes migration decisions. In the third part, we look at migration frictions. And here we look at them as either, whatever is coming out of our model that is different between migrants with and without our family. Or in the version B, we have actually a mapping between those migration costs to HOCO policy, so we can change the margins that seem to be policy-driven. And finally, in the fourth counterfactual, we'll be removing or relaxing overall migration frictions, using here this mapping from tau to policy and seeing how that affects migration patterns. We'll be interested in the allocation of migrants across cities, the incidence of family migration, and also how many consumption balance and remittance flow across space. So I try, and now I'm out of time, so I'll try and to be very quick. So I'll go just through the different lines of this table and I'll be done. So the first one is just the baseline. So you've got 28 million migrants, out of which 14 are concentrated in megacities, so 5 million and above. If you shut down remittances, so if you don't allow people to consume at origin and remit income, you see that migrant numbers plummet, and basically almost very few of them will choose to go to these expensive megacities. So basically this remittance motive is key to understanding how much migration there is, but also how it's distributed across space. if we play with the cost of educations for migrants, and if we reduce the cost of education for migrants, if we do it across destination, if basically we ensure that the cost of education is the same across space, we see a slight increase in migration numbers, but also migrants are very happy of flocking to those mega cities where education was so expensive. If you do a target subsidy, which is something the Chinese government might be interested in doing, because they've been very keen to get people to go to medium-sized cities. So if you do a subsidy that's only for medium-sized cities, you can actually be very effective at, you're not creating a huge surge of migration, but you are decreasing the number of migrants who go to mega cities. Okay, so you can use those subsidized education costs to incentivize migrants to change their destination. Of course, this also increases the overall number of migrants who go with their family. Now, if we play with family-specific migration costs, that is, we basically neutralize the surplus of migration costs that comes with migrating with your family. And that's just what we observe from the model, or that might be what we can link directly to policy. So if you're removing that component, what's interesting is that there's not a lot of increase in migration numbers. It's almost the same. But what's interesting is that you have really a shift in the family share of those migrants. So there's a lot more migrants migrating with family, with important welfare gains. Okay, and rather no change, or rather a reduction in the number of people going to this megacity. Now, the last exercise is pretty standard, but that's the one that we can really do to compare our model with other what's been shown in other papers, is to relax migration frictions due to HOCO across the board, like for both types of migration. So what you see, as you expect, you see an increase in migration, and you see a small increase in the family share with a relatively large increase of the number of migrants going to megacities. So overall, the HOCO policies are holding migration back and holding them back from going to megacities. However, what we think we are learning from the other counterfactuals is that you can really have a more nuanced view of what are the determinants of so the role basically of consumption motives and of the policy-driven family penalties. You can really think through those to basically either target policies or think through migration motives that affect not only the type of migration that people engage in, but also where they end up going to. And I'm out of time, so I just won't conclude.
It's fantastic. I was actually going to propose to avoid the slide and just jumping into, directly asking people whether they have any questions. Please raise your hand if you have any question, and we'll open the mic for you. Do we have anyone? Okay, so maybe I should just get started, and then someone else will jump in as we go. So this part of it that is like housing costs, of course, are going to be like a big driver of this. Right, so that's the way you sort of thinking about it. Like the non-tradable is part, housing cost. And I was wondering whether you'd given a thought about, I guess, a specific housing policy that could actually be in the counterfactual exercise. I guess removing every friction, that's sort of part of it. But specifically on the housing cost, do you have any sense of it? Because that can apply to other contexts too.
No, that's really so that's really interesting. No, we haven't done this. Yes, we now counterfactually we're looking at education because there's really explicit, basically, policy barriers to access to education. But so that was the easier one to map in directly into policy. But I think you're right. So basically changing directly housing costs, or changing the housing supply elasticities.
Yeah, exactly. That's
would have effects both on migration decisions and on the type of migration we would see.
Fantastic.
Yeah, and I think there is a policy aspect to this also, which is to access to ownership, housing ownership, etc. So that's depending on the city, you might have restriction there. So okay, yeah. So no, we haven't thought about this, but implicitly, for example, in our estimation, when we're thinking of constraints, land supply constraints, this is something that could be affected by policy. We're looking at geographical constraints, but of course, policy could help them. Yeah.
Nico, you're
Yeah,
next.
so related to your point, Giacomo, could you think of just more in general, like amenities in cities, right? Like the availability of, I don't know, public parks, or how far away workers are going to be located from the places where they work, etc. That could also, be part of what Giacomo was mentioning.
Yeah. So okay, I did mention amenities in passing, but I did not highlight the fact that in our model, the non-monetary value of being in a place is going to end up in the residual. So those tiles that we have, so those tiles that we have here will capture the value of being in a place. So where we struggled a bit with amenities is because you could think of them as being either completely separate from consumption or partly complement with consumption, etc. So if you're thinking, so clearly in our context, we're thinking of schooling as being an expenditure. You could think of good schools as being a positive amenity. Or like, so I think depending, so yeah, so we haven't, we do relate those tiles that we have with amenities such as, for example, pollution. So you see that, that they do correlate with what you think as these amenities at destination. So that part is definitely there. But some things that we often classify as amenities could end up in the consumption component. And we
Got it.
Yeah.
Got it. Thank you.
Yeah.
Laszlo, you should be able to talk now.
Yes, thank you. Well, actually, my question is somewhat related to the possibility for external validity. In this respect, migration, we know that rather dependent on the, so to say, the characteristics of the origin, which might be influenced, for example, by contacts who might be already there, who might be giving some information on the possibilities at the destination level. And this is a very, very strong influence. It is very strong force we have seen in Europe and elsewhere. Do you see any possibility for that in your survey? Because that could increase significantly the possibility for external validity. Thank you.
So yeah, thank you for your question. So China is special in many respects, but the migration choices, I think the way we model them and we estimate them, I think they're very similar across contexts. So the migrants we're looking at, they make their decisions to migrate. They make their decisions to choose where to migrate based on different things, some of which we explicitly model. So there would be, so people do go to Filipino migrants do go to the US because wages are high there. Okay, so those monetary determinants are there in every context. Now, as you point out, Filipino migrants might know more about the US, and that's why they're more likely to go. So in our context, it will be the case that for a given rule origin, there will be a value of going to a destination that is higher because this destination is linked to you via, for example, migration networks. And this is definitely taking place in our setting. There's independent evidence of this. And this will be captured for us in this bilateral term, this tau RU. Okay, so it is a tau RU. And so in the same way that Nicolas was thinking of amenities, could be thinking of those ties, or think of it as information flows, as adding to the value of going to a specific urban destination if you're coming from a particular rural origin. I think in terms of external validity, one thing we provide is, for example, some evidence that international migrants seem to be world over locating in those large cities and doing so without relatives. Okay, so that's another as thinking of external validity. So we're thinking that this crucial choice of going with or without your family, and this interaction with the choice of destination, that's really relevant world over. So Filipino migrants going to the US because wages are high, not bringing their family because it's costly to work to live there.
Nice. Anyone from the floor? I don't want to monopolize the discussion, so if there is someone else. Garance, you have you're muted, Garance.
Yeah.
Mute yourself.
Sorry. I was wondering about factors like having grandparents or not to take care of the children, how much that impact the choice of moving with or without your family. And then what about change? Something that may not be fixed would be change of sectors, because in some sense, if what's booming now are jobs where I need to work full time, this, that, then, kid is better with the grandparents and not be busy. Like, are those things that are relevant or not? Like,
yes, so they're relevant. They're relevant, but we don't really.
Can I jump on this because I had the same question with something else? So thanks, Garant. Now I'm going to monopolize it. So yeah, the dimensional heterogeneity that you want to take into account, right, are multiple, and at the individual level, at the moment, you're not really doing that, and I guess that's what Garant is sort of hinting upon. There's some observable stuff and some observable stuff.
Yes. So whether the grandparents are around, we know it if they stayed. If they migrate, they're enumerated in the census, they're living in that dorm. We don't know whether their parents, say, are alive and could take care of their children at home. Okay, so that's not we don't so we don't have data for that. We're thinking that we're really making improvements in the sense that in questions that have already been looked at in context of international migration, where it's really hard to keep track of people, of where they go, etc., and relating them to their choices at origin, etc. We're thinking we're making progress, but there's still things that are just very hard to capture. And I think the complete family composition of migrants, both at destination and at home, is not something we have. So the best we have is for mothers. They've asked women whether they have children, whether they're alive, whether they're with them or back home. So that's the only thing we really observe. Now, so that's that dimension. It definitely plays a role. It's just not something we can, put in empirically. We could put it in the model, but then it would be, meaningless empirically. In terms of other aspects of heterogeneity, yes. So one is gender. So one thing we do is we estimate our model for mothers only. Okay. So that's sort of that gives, I think, some sense that the sort of both qualitatively and quantitatively, the sense that the behavior that we're looking at is relevant in those for both men and women. Now, you might want to think about many other dimensions of heterogeneity, such as education, income, etc. Yeah,
Alice.
Yes. Hello. So thanks a lot. Thanks for the very interesting paper and presentation. I was just wondering again, like maybe zooming into the issue of the family structure. I mean, your model is like you take the family as given, the structure as given. You have children, and you consider migrating or not. But I wonder whether, I mean, especially in China, when you have a shortage of maybe female in some areas, so you may migrate to create your family. And so I don't know exactly how you do you take in your sample people who already have families, or what is your? I don't know exactly how your results would maybe be explained differently if people move to form a
Yes.
family and maybe so.
Yeah, so that's
Not increasing consumption value is more like something else.
yeah. So we can look at married people, for example. Okay, so we can
Married,
do
yeah.
that's a dimension that we do have. We can also play with the age range to make it more likely that they would. For example, like, so people don't migrate a lot to get married, from what I understand. So that they do tend to get married back home, even if they marry after they got married, they migrated. But people migrate a lot for education also. So we have to be careful about those other motives for migration, and we're thinking that they're more relevant for the youngest part of the sample. So that's something we do in the stylus fact. I don't know if we've looked at in this answer. It would be a useful thing to do. Thank you. Yes.
I guess we are slightly out of time, so over time. So I should just thank Clément and Yanos, as well as Marlon, who have been very effective at answering the Q&A. So thanks so much, everyone. Clément is going to be on his personal Zoom room. It is posted on the chat for those of you who want to just jump in and chat a little bit more with Clément. Just immediately after this, as soon as you close this. But please copy and paste the Zoom address, otherwise you're not going to be able to recover it. Having said this, again, thanks so much for being here. Thanks so much, Clément. And
thank you for having us. Paper.
And as you can see, in a couple of weeks, you're going to have Atch talking about earned wages for low-income workers. And that's about it for us. Thank you so much, and see you in 2 weeks.
Thank you, everyone. Bye-bye.
Thank you.
Thank you. Bye-bye.